My father said those words on a Tuesday. I remember because I had just worked a double shift, and my scrub still smelled like antiseptic when I walked through the front door of the house I had been paying the mortgage on for 6 years. He was sitting in the armchair by the window, the one I had bought him when his back started giving him trouble, and he didn't even look up from the television when he said it. "I've been thinking," he said, "and I've decided the house goes to Daniel." I stood there in the hallway, still holding my car keys, and I felt something very quiet happen inside my chest. Not an explosion. Not a collapse. Something quieter than both of those. Like a single thread being pulled from a sweater you've spent years knitting, and you already know, before it even starts unraveling, that the whole thing is going. "Okay," I said, and I walked to my room. 2 weeks later, I did something my father never thought I was capable of. And I did it calmly, in front of everyone he had ever wanted to impress. But before I tell you what happened in that living room, in front of all those relatives and neighbors and people who had spent years nodding along while my family told their version of my story, I have to take you back. Because you need to understand what it cost to get to that moment. You need to understand what okay really meant coming from me after everything that had already happened. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where quiet people finally tell the truth about the families that underestimated them.
I'm Maya Reeves.
I'm 34 years old, and this is the story of the house, the ledger, and the Tuesday that changed everything. I grew up in a medium-sized house in a medium-sized city where everyone knew everyone's business except the business happening behind closed doors. My father, Gerald Reeves, was a man who presented himself to the world as reasonable, even generous. He coached youth baseball for 11 years. He brought casseroles to neighbors when someone passed. He shook hands firmly and looked people in the eye and said things like, "Family comes first," with a conviction that made you believe he actually meant it. My mother, Sandra, was softer in person and harder in practice. She was the kind of woman who would cry at a funeral for someone she'd spoken badly of all year. She loved the idea of loving her children more than she sometimes loved the actual work of it. She was not cruel. I want to be fair about that. She was just absent in a way that was hard to name. Present in the room, but unreachable. I used to try to tell her things when I was small, and she'd nod in the right places, and later I'd realize she hadn't heard a word. Then there was Daniel. Daniel is 3 years younger than me, and he has always been, to my parents, the point of everything. That is not bitterness speaking. It is just the arithmetic of my childhood. When Daniel cried, the house reorganized itself. When Daniel was happy, my mother hummed. When Daniel struggled in school, my father sat at the kitchen table with him for hours. When I struggled, I learned to solve it quietly before anyone noticed there was a problem. I don't think my parents sat down and decided to love Daniel more. I think it was more like water. It found the path of least resistance and just kept flowing that direction until the groove was too deep to redirect. Daniel was charming and loud and needed things visibly. I was not. I learned early that needing things made people impatient. So I stopped needing things where anyone could see. I became a nurse because I am good at managing emergencies without panicking, good at reading a room, good at knowing what someone needs before they can articulate it themselves. I have been told I am unnervingly calm in a crisis. I take it as a compliment. I know exactly where I learned that skill. The first time my family asked me for money, I was 22 years old, 3 months into my first nursing job, and still living in a studio apartment with a mattress on the floor because I hadn't been able to afford a bed frame yet. My father called me on a Wednesday evening and told me the property tax on the family home had come due, and he was short. He said it in the same tone he used to tell me to pass the salt. Factual, unbothered, not particularly apologetic. He said he'd pay me back by the end of the month. The amount was $840. I transferred it from my account that same night. I had $912 to my name at the time. I told myself, this is what families do. This is what it means to be the oldest. This is temporary. He did not pay me back by the end of the month. He did not pay me back at all. I know this because I started keeping a notebook. I don't remember exactly when I started writing things down. I think it began less as documentation and more as a way to process. I'm a nurse. I understand the importance of keeping records, of not trusting memory alone. The notebook was small, navy blue, with a gold elastic closure. I bought it at a pharmacy on my lunch break sometime in my second year of working. And I started writing down every request, every transfer, every "this is the last time," and "we'll make it right." That notebook would become the most important object in my life. But I didn't know that yet. If you've ever been the family member that everyone calls when they need something, not to talk, not to celebrate, but specifically when they need something, then I want you to tell me that in the comments. Because I have a feeling I'm not alone in this room. The requests came in patterns, which I only recognized later when I looked at the notebook from a distance. January was always hard, after Christmas spending. Spring brought car repairs. Summer had a way of producing unexpected trips or Daniel's various ventures. Fall was back to school costs for Daniel's kids, even before he had kids, just anticipatory anxiety about future expenses that somehow became present obligations. In the year I turned 24, I gave my family a total of $4,300. I know this because it is written in the notebook in my own handwriting. Rent shortfalls, a car repair for my father, Daniel's community college enrollment fee that my parents couldn't cover, my mother's dental work. For each of these, I received the same things: gratitude that lasted about 48 hours, a promise to repay that was never specific enough to hold anyone accountable, and this is the one that kept me coming back, the unmistakable warmth that came with being needed. They would call me sweetheart. My mother would say, "I don't know what we'd do without you, Maya." My father would clap me on the shoulder. I am a nurse. I understand what it means to confuse being needed with being valued. I have watched patients do it with their doctors, do it with their families. I recognized it in myself only years after the pattern was already well established. Being needed is not the same as being loved. I wrote that in the notebook too. Not because I had figured it out, just because I was starting to suspect it. When I was 25, I met a man named Calvin. Calvin was an electrician, steady-handed and funny, with a laugh that came from somewhere deep and real. He brought me coffee on my night shifts when we were first dating, showing up at the hospital entrance with a thermos and a grin like he'd just pulled off a heist. He made me feel, for the first time in my adult life, like someone was paying attention to me specifically, not to what I could do, but to who I was. He proposed on a Thursday evening in our small apartment kitchen while something was burning on the stove because he'd been too nervous to pay attention to the timer. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We started planning. Small wedding. Neither of us wanted fuss. And a house. That was the dream. A house. Not my parents' house. Not a rental, something ours. We found a neighborhood we liked, started saving aggressively. And then my father called. It was 8 months after the engagement. My parents' mortgage was in trouble. My father had missed 4 payments because of a period of reduced work, and the bank was making serious noise. The amount needed to bring it current was $11,000. I told my father I needed to think about it. I thought about it for 4 days. I went back and forth. I listed pros and cons in the notebook. I lay awake at 3 in the morning doing math. I gave them $9,000, everything Calvin and I had saved toward the house, and my parents covered the rest with a loan from a relative. Calvin didn't leave. He was not the kind of man who left. But something shifted between us, quiet as a tide going out, and I didn't fully understand the extent of that shift until later. We postponed the wedding. Just until we rebuild the savings, I said. He nodded. We never did get married. 18 months after the engagement, Calvin sat across from me at our kitchen table and told me, with the same careful steadiness he brought to everything, that he felt like he was always going to be third in my life. After my patients and after my family.
He said he didn't think I meant it that way.
He said he believed I loved him. He said he was tired. I did not argue with him. I understood exactly what he meant. He left on a Saturday in November. He took the thermos, the one he'd used to bring me coffee, and he left the ring on the counter, which I thought was unnecessarily symbolic but also entirely fair. I put the ring in the navy blue notebook, between two pages, near the middle. I closed the elastic closure. I did not cry in front of anyone. I am, as I mentioned, very good at that. A relationship given to the people who never asked for it. That is what I wrote that night. The tragedy came in the year I turned 28, and it did not announce itself. My mother called on a Sunday morning and told me she had found a lump. Breast cancer. Early stage, good prognosis, but requiring surgery and several months of treatment. I want to be clear. I do not blame my mother for getting sick. I was her daughter and I loved her, and I am a nurse, and when someone I love is sick, I know what to do. I rearranged my schedule. I drove her to appointments. I sat with her during infusions and read to her from whatever book she was in the middle of. I became her care coordinator, her advocate, her medical translator. What I want you to understand about that year is where Daniel was. Daniel was 30 miles away, in a city that was not particularly far, with a functioning car and a flexible work schedule. He called once a week, sometimes twice, and the calls were warm and full of concern that went exactly nowhere. He sent a fruit basket in the second month, which my mother displayed prominently and mentioned to everyone who came to visit. My father, during this period, managed to deteriorate emotionally in a way that somehow also required management. He was scared. I understand that, I do, but fear expressed itself in him as a kind of helpless demand. He needed dinner at predictable times. He needed someone to tell him it would be okay. He needed rides to things he was perfectly capable of driving to himself. He needed, and I was there, and so the need came to me. My mother survived. Her prognosis was excellent, and her recovery was full. The fruit basket got mentioned in her remarks at Christmas that year when she talked about how much support she'd received. Daniel beamed. I refilled the bread basket and did not say anything. The following spring, I did something I had been meaning to do for years but kept postponing because there was always something more immediate to handle. I bought a house. Not the dream house Calvin and I had imagined. A modest 3-bedroom in a quiet part of the city, close to the hospital where I worked. The down payment had taken me 4 years to save after the first attempt had been rerouted to my parents' mortgage. I was 31 years old. I had gray at my temples that my coworkers were kind enough not to mention. I walked through the door of that house for the first time with the keys in my hand, and I stood in the empty living room for a very long moment. It felt like breathing out after holding it for a long time. The front door of that house was painted red by the previous owners. I had planned to repaint it, but I never did. I came to love the red door. It was the kind of color that said, "Here. This is here." I did not invite my family to the closing. I did not tell them about it immediately. I told them a few weeks later, casually, the way you mention a haircut. My mother said, "How nice." My father said the neighborhood sounded fine. Daniel asked if I needed help moving, waited for me to say no, and looked relieved. Life in that house was, for the first time in my adult life, genuinely mine. I planted tomatoes in the backyard that first summer and killed all of them, which I accepted philosophically. I bought a bed frame, a real one with a headboard, the kind I had wanted since I was 22, with a mattress on the floor. I adopted a cat named Premise, who was opinionated and warm and did not require anything from me except presents, which I found I had plenty of. I still helped my family.
I want to be accurate about that.
The notebook continued. A few hundred here, an emergency there. But I had established, without ever announcing it, a kind of internal boundary, a ceiling. I kept records. I answered calls, but did not always answer them immediately. I showed up at holidays, but drove myself and left at a reasonable hour. My family, in this period, began to construct a narrative that I only heard about secondhand. The story, as it reached me through cousins and family friends, went roughly like this. Maya pulled away. Maya got cold. Maya bought herself a house and decided her family wasn't good enough. Maya changed. None of this was technically a lie. I had pulled back. I was less immediately available. I had bought a house. I had changed. What the story left out was why. The story also left out the notebook, the numbers, the $9,000, Calvin, and the thermos. The Tuesday, I drove my mother to radiation therapy for the fourth week running while Daniel's name was on the fruit basket. The years and years of being the person everyone called when they needed something and never called just to ask how I was. My father, to his credit, never explicitly said any of these things. He was not a dramatic man. He simply allowed the story to form and settle around him like sediment, and he never did anything to disturb it. I heard the version about cold Maya and distant Maya from my cousin Renata at a birthday party I almost didn't attend. She said it with some hesitation, watching my face carefully, like she was delivering news she wasn't sure how to frame. I thanked her for telling me. I drove home. I sat in the red door house with Premise on my lap, and I thought, of course this is how it gets told. I wrote in the notebook that night. Not numbers. Just, they rewrote it. And let them. The call came on a Thursday in October, 3 years after I bought the house. It was Daniel. This was notable in itself. Daniel called our parents. Daniel called me when he needed something or when prompted by our mother. Daniel did not call just to call. So when I saw his name on my screen at 7 in the evening, I felt the particular stillness that precedes something difficult. Dad had a fall, he said. My father had been having some balance issues for months. I knew this because my mother had mentioned it, and because I had been the one to quietly research what questions to ask his doctor the next time someone brought him in for a checkup. Daniel may not have known about the balance issues, or he may have known and filed it under things that would sort themselves out. The fall was bad enough to require hospitalization. A hip fracture, surgery, a rehabilitation stay. Serious, but, and I say this as a nurse with experience, manageable, survivable, not a death sentence. I was at the hospital the evening after it happened. I spoke to his care team. I understood the plan. I communicated it to my mother and Daniel in terms they could follow because that is what I do. During the week my father was in the hospital, something else happened. Something that had nothing to do with the hip. My Aunt Patricia, my mother's sister, the family archivist, the keeper of documents, was cleaning out a storage unit she had been renting for 15 years. She found a box that had belonged to my grandmother. In the box was a letter. The letter was addressed to both me and Daniel. It had been written by my grandmother 9 years prior, approximately 8 months before she passed. It had never been delivered. My grandmother, Vivian, had owned a small property, a rental house she'd accumulated through 40 years of careful living and modest inheritance. In the letter, she described her wishes clearly. The rental property was to be divided equally between me and Daniel, not given to my parents to manage, not folded into the family finances, given directly to me and Daniel in equal shares. The property had been sold 12 years ago. I found out about the letter on a Tuesday evening when Aunt Patricia drove to my house and sat at my kitchen table and placed it in front of me with both hands, like she was delivering something sacred. She had tears in her eyes. She said, "I didn't know, Maya. I found it in the box, and I didn't know." I read it twice. I looked at the date. I thought about the year the property was sold. I thought about the $9,000. I thought about what the letter described, a specific, loving account of wanting to make sure her granddaughter had something solid beneath her feet. I opened the navy blue notebook. I put the letter inside it, next to the ring. Then I sat very still for a while. 3 days after Aunt Patricia's visit, my mother called. She said my father was recovering well, and they were hopeful about his timeline for returning home. She said the house was going to need some modifications, a walk-in shower, some railing installations, and that these things cost money. She said, voice careful and light, "We were thinking it might be time to have a family conversation." I said that sounded reasonable.
She paused.
Then she said, "We'd love for you to come to Sunday dinner. Bring the notebook if you want. Your father has some things he wants to discuss." I was quiet for a moment. I said, "What kind of things?" She said, "Oh, the future, the house, all of it."
I said, "Okay."
"I'll be there." She sounded pleased in a way that I recognized. The way she'd sounded when I was 22 and agreed to wire the $840. A relief that hadn't bothered to dress itself up as gratitude. I brought the notebook. Sunday dinner at my parents' house was a full production. This was not a small, intimate conversation. I understood that as soon as I arrived and found 6 cars in the driveway. Relatives I hadn't seen in over a year. My mother's best friend from church, Gloria. Cousins. Daniel and his wife, Lisa, and their 2 kids running in the backyard. My mother met me at the door with a hug that lasted slightly longer than usual. She looked good. She'd recovered fully from treatment years ago and had the health to show for it. She took my coat and said the food was almost ready and that everyone was so happy I came. My father was in his armchair, hip recovering, a cane leaning against the wall nearby. He looked older than I remembered. The fall had done something to his posture, shrunk him slightly into himself. When he saw me, he said, "Maya, good. Not warm, not cold. Just factual." His version of welcome. After dinner, when the plates were cleared and the children had been settled in front of a movie in the back room, my father cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he said, and the room settled, and I felt the attention of everyone present orient itself like compass needles toward north, and "I've decided the house goes to Daniel." He said it the way he had said it to me 2 weeks ago in the hallway. Factual. Unbothered. But this time there was an audience. This time he continued. "Maya's set up fine. She's got her own house. Daniel's got the kids, the family situation. It makes sense for the family home to stay with him." He nodded once, like he'd settled a matter of simple logistics. Several people were nodding. My cousin Renata, the one who had told me about cold Maya, was looking at the table. Daniel had the look of a man who had been told this outcome in advance and was trying to appear appropriately modest about it. Lisa, his wife, was watching me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Something careful in it. My mother said, "We just want what's best for everyone," in her particular tone, the one that made unreasonable things sound inevitable. I looked around the room. I thought about the $840. I thought about Calvin and the thermos. I thought about sitting in a hospital infusion room reading aloud to my mother while Daniel's fruit basket sat on the counter. I thought about my grandmother's letter, sitting in the navy blue notebook in my bag. I said, "Dad, can I ask you something?" He looked at me. Mildly surprised, I usually just said okay and moved on. "Do you remember what you told me when Mom needed money for her dental work in 2013? A small quiet. You said, 'Family carries each other, Maya. That's what we do.'" He didn't deny it. He had, in fact, said exactly that. I had written it in the notebook within an hour of the conversation. "I've been carrying," I said. "I'd like to show everyone what that's looked like." I opened my bag. I took out the navy blue notebook. I set it on the table, and I began to read.
I did not yell.
I have never yelled in a crisis. It is the single least useful thing a person can do in an emergency, and I have been managing emergencies for 12 years. I read clearly, calmly, in the same voice I used to explain a diagnosis to a patient's family.
Date.
Amount. Stated reason. Stated promise of repayment. Date of non-repayment. I read for about 4 minutes. The total, across 12 years, came to $63,420. The room was very quiet. My father said nothing. My mother had both hands pressed flat on the table in front of her. Daniel said quietly, "Maya, I didn't." "I know," I said. "I'm not reading this for you." I looked at my father. "Then I need to tell everyone about a letter," I said. "A letter from Grandma Vivian that was written 9 years ago and never delivered." I took the letter out from between the pages of the notebook. I read that too. I watched the room process it. The property. The sale. The split that was supposed to happen and didn't. Aunt Patricia, sitting near the window, pressed her hand to her mouth. She had already known, but hearing it read aloud in that room was different. My father, to his credit, and this is the truest thing I can say about Gerald Reeves, did not construct an excuse on the spot. He sat in his armchair, and he looked at his hands. That was all. My mother said, "We were in a difficult time." "I know," I said. "I've always known when you were in a difficult time." I kept very good records. I closed the notebook. I put it and the letter back in my bag. Then I said the thing I had been, without knowing it, walking toward for 12 years. "Dad, you said family carries each other. I believe that. I've always believed that. But carrying only works if more than one person is doing the lifting." I stood up. The house should go to Daniel. I agree with that. I've had years to build my own foundation. But I wanted to go to Daniel with everyone in this room, knowing the full story of how I spent those same years. I looked around the table. At Gloria, who had put down her coffee cup. At my cousin Renata, who was crying quietly. At Lisa, Daniel's wife, who had both arms wrapped around herself like she was cold. I said, "I don't want anything from you. I'm not here for the house. I'm here because for 12 years I let a story be told about me that wasn't true, and I have decided that's done." Then I said, "Dinner was wonderful, Mom." And I picked up my bag and I walked to the front door. The red door. My own red door was at home, and I was going to it. Behind me, I heard Daniel say, quietly but clearly, "Dad, how could you not tell me?" It was not a question. The aftermath was not a movie ending. I want to be clear about that because I think we do each other a disservice when we pretend that truth-telling produces immediate and complete transformation. My father did not apologize that night. He has not apologized since, in any direct, unambiguous way. What he has done, what I know because my mother told me, in a phone call 3 weeks later that was the most honest conversation we have ever had, is sit in his armchair for a long time after I left and be very quiet and not speak for the rest of the evening. My mother described it as the most unsettled she had ever seen him. I don't know if that constitutes regret. I have decided it is not my responsibility to determine whether it does. Daniel called me 2 days after the dinner. He did not make excuses. He said, "I had no idea the numbers were like that." He said, "I should have been doing more. I knew I should have been doing more and I didn't, and I don't have a good reason for that." He said, "I want to fix it, but I know saying that isn't the same as doing it." I told him I appreciated the call. I told him I was not ready to see him yet, but that I wasn't close to it. He said that was fair. He said he was going to start contributing to our parents' expenses. He said he'd already talked to Lisa, and they'd agreed. I believed him. Not because people always follow through, but because Daniel's voice had a quality in it I hadn't heard before, something undone, something that had genuinely shifted. People can surprise you, even the ones you've filed under unlikely. Lisa, his wife, sent me a handwritten card. It said, "I always sensed something wasn't right in the way the story got told about you. I should have said something sooner.
I'm sorry."
I put the card in the notebook. Aunt Patricia and I have had dinner twice since. She is 81 years old and sharper than anyone gives her credit for, and she has apologized for the letter more times than I've needed her to. I told her the 4th time that I've accepted the apology and we don't have to revisit it. She nodded and then poured me more wine, which felt like the right response. The letter from my grandmother, I am still deciding what to do about. There are legal questions that an attorney I consulted has said are complicated by the time elapsed and the fact that the property was sold. There may be some remedy.
There may not be.
I am holding that possibility, without urgency, something I could not have done 12 years ago, but can now. My father sent a card for my birthday in November. It had a bird on the front, a cardinal, bright red, and inside he had written, in his careful, precise handwriting, "Hope you are well. The house is quieter.
Dad."
I read it standing at my mailbox. I put it in my coat pocket. I went inside. I sat with Premise on the couch for a while. I thought about whether there was a message in those few lines, or whether it was just what it looked like, a man who had spent his whole life being factual, trying to reach across a distance he'd created, in the only language he had. I haven't responded yet. The letter sits on my kitchen counter. I'm not ready, but I'm also not closed. Here is what I know about the year that's passed since that Sunday dinner. I repainted the backyard fence in the spring, and I grew tomatoes again, and this time they lived. All 6 plants. I stood in the backyard on a July evening with one in my hand, warm from the sun, improbably real, and I thought about all the things I had planted over the years that hadn't made it, and how that hadn't been the point. I have a person in my life now. His name is Marcus. He is a physical therapist with an extremely strong opinion about posture and a very gentle way of being in the world. He has never needed me to rescue him from anything. He makes me coffee in the morning not because I work night shifts, but just because he is awake first, and it is a kind thing to do. I told him about the notebook on our 4th date, not because I needed him to understand everything immediately, but because I have learned that the truth, told early, saves everyone a significant amount of time. He listened to the whole thing. He said, "That's a lot of weight to carry." I said, "I know. I'm working on putting it down." He nodded. He refilled my coffee. I still have the notebook. I haven't written new numbers in it. But I haven't gotten rid of it either, because I think objects carry what words can't always hold, and that notebook held 12 years of a story that almost no one knew. It deserves to be kept somewhere. The red door of my house is still red. I have never repainted it. I've touched up a chip here and there, but the color remains. I come home to it every shift, sometimes at 7 in the morning when the light is flat and gray, and I am tired in the specific way that nursing makes you tired, and I look at it and I think, here, this is here. That is enough. For now, that is genuinely enough. If any part of this story sounds like something you've lived through, the quiet carrying, the rewritten narrative, the moment you finally stop saying, okay, I want you to leave a comment. Not because I need the validation, but because I think there are a lot of people in this room who have been quiet about something for a long time, and sometimes the most useful thing is just knowing someone else was in that hallway too. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Calm Drama Stories. We are here every week for the people who finally decided to tell the truth. And I have decided going forward to only carry what I choose to carry. That's all.